We are back, and let me continue now with a third argument from a third Muslim scholar, Siraj Islam Mufti, who elaborates on sovereignty and legitimacy in an Islamic political order. He writes, "The people or the Ummah are the actual repository of Khilafah, and those in authority must have the confidence and support of the Muslim population. In this context, Sharia provides a broad framework within which the people under the umbrella of divine guidance participate in developing a civil society and its institutions, including various organs of the state." And so therefore, it's a little more technical, but it's also more elaborate to make that distinction. There's also a misunderstanding of, again, in these dark times of ours, that is manipulated, terminologies that are manipulated both by the Muslim side or by the side of those in power in Muslim majority states, as well as by their political opponents in the West. That an Islamic state is sometimes pinned in the concept of Dar al-Islam, a term that implies a dominion of peace or Pax Islamica, like its historical counterpart, the Pax Romana. The term was coined to distinguish the prosperous and peaceful Muslim societies in contradistinction to the warrior culture of Europe in the Middle Ages. How things have changed. Some Islamists incorrectly interpret Dar al-Islam to mean the establishment of a global Islamic theocracy. Now, this argument by the Islamists is as flawed as its portrayal by their ideological opponents in the West, who claim that, Muslim jihadists are out to dominate the world, and therefore we must fight them. Now, in reality, however, the perpetual foreign military incursions into the regions have turned the Muslim land into Dar al-Harb, which is the counterpart of Dar al-Islam, the dominion of war, a circumstance that calls for the necessity of deterrence and self-defense, but the Western corporate media, with plenty of help from the dysfunctional disarray of local resistors, portray such resistance as an imminent threat to world peace, to conveniently justify Western invasions and occupations of Muslim lands. A return to the dominion of peace would be a timely and appropriate campaign with the willing participation of the intruding warring parties. The argument is as follows, that for those of you who have followed the world history, there was a time of Pax Romana, that the Roman Empire became so established and so pervasive and powerful that they created a state of peace in the world. Well, the Muslims did the same. So that Pax Islamica was referred to a state and a stage in a period of history in the Muslim majority societies of today, that, or rather of that time, that in these lands there were no wars. The Europeans were fighting among themselves, maybe the Africans were fighting among themselves, and say the Chinese were probably doing the same thing, but the land which was the kind of the centerpiece of this global chessboard was rather peaceful. Again, not to kind of express it as a fantasizing, elusive notion, but rather a factual reality. If you go to the travels of Ibn Battuta, for example, who was the most traveled person in his time, and I think I'd heard figures such as 57,000 miles and such, that he traveled through Africa, through Central Asia, through Caucasus, through India, through China, and he went around and around the world of the non-Muslim world, where he, as a Muslim scholar, whenever he ran out of money, he got a job as a judge or in some other state institutions and made enough money so he could continue his travels. And these were all possible because there was peace. There was Dar al-Islam. There was a Pax Islamica. Now, that did not mean that Muslims were imposing an Islamic theocracy on other societies. Other societies existed alongside, and they would have been often in turmoil. That was just a fact of the history of the time. But that Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam was made, that distinction was made simply to show there was the land of peace and there is a land of war. But no talk of the imposition of a theocracy. That is as wrong by some Muslim fanatics, extremists who are manipulating this politically, as it is wrong by Westerners who are using that as justification by fighting and invading and occupying Muslim lands as they do now. So two wrong interpretations upon whom they act to the misery of the millions. Another critical distinction lost on most Islamist movements is that of administering an Islamic government versus establishing an Islamic state. Now, let me repeat that. Administering an Islamic government versus establishing an Islamic state. An Islamic government implies the political party within an Islamic platform, upon winning an election, can undertake the duties of a state institutions in the name of and on behalf of all citizens. Now, we have, for instance, in the West, see the Christian Democrats. They are not establishing a theocracy. They have a political party platform which is rooted in certain Christian principles, but that they want to apply this democratically if that particular party wins an election. So we have several Christian democratic parties in Europe, I think in Germany and Italy and perhaps in other states, and that would be fine. This is having an Islamic government, not an Islamic state, the equivalent of. We have the Shas party, we have the Bharatiya Janata party in India, we have the Justice and Development Party, the AKP in Turkey, and all of these are very successful participants in the political process of their government, where a party platform is based on a particular religious principle. What is lost on many in the Muslim world is that they don't want an Islamic government, they want an Islamic state. That if a particular Islamic party comes to power, they want to take over the whole thing. They don't want to act as guests for the period of time that they have political authority, recognition, and have won the election for a particular term. If they do that, there will be no problem. The problem, particularly in the case of Afghanistan, was that, yes, we had a communist party that came to power, yes, through military coup and all that. But if that political party had stayed in power as a political, as a communist government, leaving Afghanistan as a non-communist state, that would have been okay. Because then, if the communist power had fallen from favor, then other parties would have taken over. But since they took over the state, not the government, that when communism fell, or the communist government fell, then the communist state fell with it, and so Afghanistan plunged into a chaos. And we could make the same argument subsequently, that then when the Islamists came and took over, for instance, after the fall of the communists, they repeated the same mistake. So they took over not the government, but the state. Whether it was Rabbani or Mujaddidi or whoever else, all these parties that took over subsequently, they took over the state, and that's the mistake. The state has to be above the government. The government is a part of the state. And we have not learned that art in Afghanistan. And that's why everyone who comes, they change everything. They change the name of the state, which they should leave where it is. They could only change the name of their government, the government of a particular political party. And that political party could be Islamist, communist, whatever, it doesn't matter. And the problem, I think, in modern Turkey is probably very similar to that in Afghanistan, except that the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, took over in 2000. They won by election, so the government was the government of the AKP, not the state. The state of Turkey remained where it was. What is happening since 2011, and even more so since 2013, is that this government of this particular party is trying to penetrate the state apparatus and take over the state of Turkey for its party, which is a mistake. And again, this is a problem in most of the Muslim world, that when any particular party comes to power, the easiest thing is to rule in the name of Islam, because religion is more manipulatable than anything else. And they mess it up for everybody. And what do they say they are against? They are against democracy, because democracy would not allow them to take over the state. Democracy would accommodate them taking over the government. legitimately through election, through popular election. That's what democracy is. And a lot of our extremist parties of all shades in the Muslim world, one of the reasons they are against democracy, and there are many, but this is one of the reasons, that if they adhere to the principles of democracy, they cannot and should not take over the state. And going back to the first argument, there is no such a thing as an Islamic state. There could be such things as Islamic political parties. Now, there is an argument about the Salafists who have hijacked the pan-Islamic concept of return to the Quran. So when pan-Islamism began as a counter-colonial policy in the Muslim world back in the 19th century, their main call was to go back to the Quran, because Muslims had distanced themselves, and that's why they were falling behind. That if they could go back to the Quran, then that would be fine. Except that in the case of the Salafist, the return to the Quran, they have recasted it as a return to the time of the Prophet. And here's the tricky part of it. When they want to return to the time of the Prophet, we talked about the argument earlier that there's no way we could live by the standards of the 7th century. And yes, humanity evolves. And if we were meant to be ruled like in the 7th century, we would have been born in the 7th century. But we were born in the 20th and 21st century. So we have to live our times. And our faith belief system should not be obsolete. If it is obsolete, if it was meant to be only for the 7th century, then that religion is dead already. We can't believe in a dead religious belief system. But if Islam is a living and kicking and acting and active and interactive faith system, then it can withstand the winds of time and the changes of time and the winds of changes and all the other combinations. And therefore, how they circumnavigate that, or rather avoid that, the main argument is that they say, no, we want to go back to the time of the Prophet to promote their ideology, which is bent on elevating the Hadith to the level of the Quran. And remember, one of the reasons we believe in Tawheed, in the oneness of God, in the absolute oneness of God as Muslims, is that nothing should be equal to God or to the Word of God. But nowadays, the Salafis would quote 20 hadith and they could not quote one ayah from the Quran. So it's not that they have elevated hadith to make it equal to the Quran. They have elevated far beyond that to make it above the Quran. What is a hadith? A narrative, a story, nothing more than that. Hadith is a story. Hadith is not a sunnah. That's different. Hadith is a story about, in many cases, about the Prophet, and in some cases, people have just made them up. They have made up stories. Because if you put them all together, if the Hadith is not a story about the Prophet, but literally said by the Prophet would have had to lived more than 100 or 200 years to have said nothing but uttering all these different sayings that amount to tens of thousands. if he had no other business, if he was not even a messenger of God, if he had nothing else to do but simply utter these hadith that are attributed to him, he would have to have lived more than hundreds of years of lifetime doing nothing but simply sitting and repeating and repeating and uttering and reciting, which is not possible. And that was not his mission. And therefore, what hadith has become, it has become the most manipulatable part of our faith system. Because when you question the Quran, you either understand it or you don't understand it. But there's no disagreement as to what constitutes the Quran. You cannot manipulate the wording, you may manipulate the meaning. Whereas with hadith, as they say, it's a dime a dozen. They were written in times of political crisis with people who had ulterior motives and political agenda. And once they were written, if someone just claimed them to be the words of the Prophet, no one had the daring and the audacity to say otherwise, and they remained. We see their invalidity because they contradict most of them. Not some of them, most of them contradict the principles of the Quran. So, this radical stand constitutes a digression from the Quranic principles, and the idea of the return from which the Salafiyya draw their name, Salafiyya, return, draws their name. It contradicts the notion that Islam is for all ages. If we were to return, that means we don't have the capacity to live in the times that God had given us birth in. People in the 7th century were born in the 7th century, lived in the 7th century. Islam is not obsolete. We were born in the 20th and 21st century, and Islam has Quran has a timelessness to it, an eternity of its own. I'm speaking in strictly religious context here. So if that is the case, they are contradicting the very word of Quran because they have to make it obsolete for now so they can take us to the past. So the Salafists are so detached from the reality that they don't see the irony in the fact that Islam was in sync with every one of the past 14 centuries. In the past 14 centuries, nobody said we want to go back to the time of the Prophet. Yes, we love the Prophet, but we don't have to go to his time because we were not born in his time. But somehow its incompatibility with the 21st century demands a return to the 7th century. How many millions over the centuries could have been wrong that none of them wanted to return, and all of a sudden the Salafis comes in the 21st century and says, no, we were just born in the wrong time. Okay. And Osman bin Bakr's implied rejection of the regressive Salafist thought comes as follows. He writes, Islamic Sharia has to be necessarily broad and comprehensive in its treatment of societal laws and ethics, since it is the last sacred law to be revealed to humankind. In this sense, it must always be contemporary and even modern. It has to address itself to the needs of a world that is increasingly complex in its cultural makeup and societal organization. What I just said was perhaps in some ways a paraphrase of what Bakar has said. Now, Muslim societies are not merely adopting the very medieval Christian thing that they once resented themselves. They are adopting the entirety of the Dark Ages along with it. Idealizing the past is not to regress and escape from the unpleasant reality of the here and now. you can't escape today's reality because you want to go back. Time will not allow you. But to learn from it, to learn from all the unpleasant reality of the present and move forward with it. Lessons learned from the failed attempts to democratize should be used as the building blocks of an evolving creative political thought to free the mind in order to free the masses. Muslim societies must be able to reclaim their ideals in democracy and modernity, not as a Western and alien phenomena, but as a universal human yearning to live under an accountable and responsible government of their choosing. Now, we could also refer to the concept that the success of foreign intervention in Muslim affairs is mainly due to the absence of a cohesive collective consciousness on the part of the Muslim intelligentsia that must address the current political malaise beyond sound bites and sloganeering, just as the thwarted Arab Spring seems no more than a desert of depression, and the many declared revolutions and republics of the great century did not cut the mustard. Declaring the state of caliphate in name only will not make it so. Muslims must respond to today's reality in tomorrow's terms. And let me share with you one historical example, or a few historical examples, that every time the Muslim societies in the past have one way or another played with the concept of mixing reason and revelation, not in the theoretical sense, but applying concepts of theocracy, or creating a state in the name of God, an Islamic republic of sorts. Every time they had fallen on their face. The society in Andalus in Spain was among the most progressive in human history in respect to the law and rules of civility, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived side by side. And they progressed and they prospered. And it was wonderful. And then one day, the Al-Murabitun got up and they had a dream that they must turn every citizen into a Muslim. Theocracy. And at that time, more than 77% of the people in Spain were Muslims. But yes, the balance, 13% were not. So here they come from North Africa and they wanted to turn everyone into a Muslim, impose a religion, impose the will of God, acting as representatives of God, doing things that even the Prophet did not do. And when they declared that everyone must become a Muslim, the non-Muslims ran to the north. They asked for help, and they gathered steam and storm, and the Christian kingdoms of the north became stronger and powerful because they were fighting for their survival, for the survival of their faith communities, which all previous Muslim states had allowed to nourish. And the result was the Reconquista, and it took several centuries and tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives and forced conversions and the retaking of the entire Iberian Peninsula, where Islam was then at the border of France, eventually receded to North Africa. That was the result of theocracy in Islam. We had the Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, the Fatimid ruler of Egypt, who too not only declared a theocracy, but in fact he claimed himself to be the Almighty, combining the principle of Shia Imamism with the Sunni Khilafah, and he declared himself both and attacked and destroyed the Church of the Sepulchre, where the Christians who lived peacefully with Muslims for centuries had to send a word to the West that Christianity was under attack. That prompted the Crusades, wars that lasted for more than 100 years and destroyed the wonderful relationship between at least the Christians of the Middle East with the Muslims. And the rest we know is history. We had the Safavid in Iran, who also declared a religious state of sorts. And they force converted the already converted Muslims who were Hanafis and Shafi'i, and force converted them into Safawi Shiism. And the great scholars and philosophers and thinkers of Persia of the time had to run for their life. Persia became impoverished because of their despotism. Yes, they got their Shiism, their brand of Shiism in place, but the great scholars that departed Persia ended up in Afghanistan and in India. And it took them a long, long time to recover from that loss. That was an Islamic theocracy. At the end of the Mughal Empire in India, the power struggle between Dara Shikoh, the wise, intelligent prince, and Aurangzeb, the fanatic. And this power struggle ended into Aurangzeb trying to appeal to the conservative Muslims, impose the jizya on the Hindus, the taxes, and the Hindus were deterred, and they resented the Muslims, and they resented them politically in a more meaningful way, and the British were ready to snatch the low-hanging fruit, and India was lost. And yes, there are semblances of theocracies in modern Republic of Iran and their relationship with minorities. We had the resemblance of the various shades of quote-unquote Islamic governments in Afghanistan since the fall of the communist government. And every one of them have done nothing but to create more resentment for their governments, more resentment for Islam, and more resentment for religion altogether. And therefore, it's not in theory that we are discussing that an Islamic government is un-Islamic, but there's ample historical evidence. In fact, not just ordinary evidence, but the greatest disasters in the Muslim history, or the Muslim Christian or Muslim Hindu history, are all the ones from the Reconquista to the Crusades to the partition of India and to the atrocities that were committed under the Safavids and all that. All of these have happened when in the few instances Muslims government wanted to have a theocracy, when the ulama were not strong enough to resist it. And so, if nothing else, history is a teacher. Now, for now, as we understand our reality and our times, we can say that the prevailing political paralysis demands a paradigmatic shift in the perceived role of states and society in the Muslim world. A mindset dazed by the deflected dreams of the past glory will remain shackled in the prison of the past. Islamist movements must make sure their political agenda is rooted in more accurate historical interpretation, authentic theoretical understanding, and verifiable historical facts. They must also adjust their 7th century ideals of a small city-state with one that meets the need of the more cosmopolitan 21st century reality. The stakes are high. The task is formidably risky, and certainly beyond the power of any one political party, movement, or state. The daring is daunting, yet the call of destiny is clear, and the challenge awaits any existing or emerging political movement to carry the theoretical faithfully to the realm of practical implementation. God be with you.